begin and create in idea a state. A quote of Socrates from the second book of Plato's Republic. Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions Podcast. This is the 34th episode of The Greek Sun, a podcast series about ancient Greek history and culture. Today we will look at what is possibly the most famous written product of ancient Greek philosophy, Plato's Republic. Before we get started, please remember to check out the website, western-traditions.org. There you can find all the episodes, as well as maps, pictures, and links to some good books to read. You can also support the podcast through the PayPal or Patreon options. Patreon supporters have access to podcast newsletters and other extras available through the podcast app. Plato wrote dozens of dialogues which purport to record the conversations he and others had with the most famous of Greek philosophers, Socrates the Athenian. In the 1st century AD, some 400 years after Socrates died, an astrologer by the name of Thrasyllus, who worked for the Roman Emperor Tiberius, he put together a volume purporting to be the full collection of Plato's dialogues. The total number of dialogues in this volume was 36, and Thrasyllus, apparently following an ancient custom, arranged these 36 dialogues in 9 tetralogies, or groups of 4, each group having some common theme or ultimate purpose, even if their individual content or schemes or timelines did not necessarily seem to align. Interestingly, the first tetralogy, or group of 4, were the dialogues that I have covered in this podcast series so far: the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Crito, and the Phaedo. The 4 dialogues that end with the death of Socrates. So if we read the remaining dialogues, we would have read first about the death of Socrates, and then we would read the remaining 32 dialogues as a sort of retrospective on his life and thought. Now, as a modern person looking at these 36 dialogues, many hundreds of thousands of words, you might doubt that Plato could really remember, word for word, every conversation that Socrates has in these books. And while I usually stress the ability of the ancients to carry around a great deal in their minds alone, such as with the ability of ancient bards to recount the entire Iliad or Odyssey without reference to an actual text, I and many others would join you in doubting that all Plato's dialogues are faithful recounting of the exact words of Socrates, but not simply because the number of words involved would be too many for the human mind. Rather, most scholars accept that the dialogues are mostly or primarily the ideas of Plato. Now, there are also other doubts among modern scholars about some of these 36 dialogues, doubts about whether Plato actually wrote them. So today, if you open a volume of Plato's complete works, quote-unquote complete, or something similarly named, you will likely only find 28 or 29 dialogues in the volume. Nevertheless, in the Western Traditions curriculum, which I lay out in the 12th series of this podcast, the syllabus for adult learners recommends all 36 of the dialogues as provided by Thrasyllus. But getting back to Plato and Socrates, now Plato was a follower of Socrates and was no doubt strongly influenced by the ideas of his father in philosophy, but it is assumed that he used Socrates not just as a guide, but as a mouthpiece for his own thoughts. Therefore, and this may come as a surprise to some, we do not have any real knowledge about what the actual Socrates thought. We are fairly certain that he existed, since other writers of the same period mention him, but while Socrates is in nearly all the dialogues of Plato, we actually don't have what we would today consider real evidence for what his ideas were. But, and this is really important to understand, not just for the sake of understanding history, but for the sake of your own thought and really for the soul inside you, which Socrates would have cherished, it is important to understand that it does not matter which dialogues, if any, represent the real thought of Socrates, nor does it matter if we get the details of his life and death right. Too often, as modern thinkers, we turn off our brains as soon as we run into a trace of doubt about quote-unquote authenticity. I'm not kidding. We simply stop thinking sometimes when this happens. We think that these details have such significance that we become uninterested in reading or thinking any further. Since I am not sure that Socrates really said this, since I'm not completely sure Moses or Jesus existed, since Plutarch lived too long after the subjects that he wrote about, since we have no proof that Homer wrote the Odyssey, well, then I'm not going to take this reading material, this dialogue, this scripture passage, this ancient text seriously. I can stop thinking critically and instead just engage in a brief and lame attempt at literary archaeology and criticism, and then go back to scrolling the internet and telling myself how intelligent I am. I assure you, the ancients did not trip themselves up this way mentally when they came to the dialogues of Plato. Did they sometimes harbor doubts about whether these were the exact words of Socrates? They might have. But it didn't matter, because what mattered was the message. What mattered was whether or not you agreed with it, whether or not you could mount an intellectual challenge to the idea in the dialogue and come to accept the meaning as true or not. When you read a text like, say, the flood account in the Bible, it doesn't matter whether you believe that Noah really existed or if a worldwide flood ever happened, and it doesn't matter how smart you think you are because you found that contradiction regarding the quantities of animals taken on the ark in chapters 6 and 7 of Genesis. Like nobody else in the last 4,000 years spotted that one. No, just you genius, you legend. It doesn't matter because that story is trying to tell you something. That particular story is trying to tell you something about personal renewal, about the need to die to one's former self sometimes, about faithfulness to a moral code, about hope in the face of destruction, and much more. So you may disagree with some of the philosophical or moral messages of such a text, as you may disagree with Socrates or Plato about what constitutes good government in the dialogue known as the Republic. I certainly disagree with Socrates here, but remember to engage the text, the idea, instead of simply detecting some fault, some doubt about authenticity, and then turning back to worshiping yourself while wearing the trappings of pseudo-intellectual superiority. And as for engaging the ideas, you should prepare yourself right now for when you read the Republic. Often today, people confuse philosophy and philosophers with left-wing ideas, with liberal politics, with the sort of soft-on-crime sorts of folks and ideas. Plato's Republic is a dialogue that espouses a philosophy about the state that might shock you or surprise you. If this dialogue is at all even just reflective of Socrates' thinking, then the powers to be in Athens had good reasons to be suspicious of the man. What you will find here is a vision of a government that may seem quite contrary to your own notions and values regarding personal freedom and freedom of thought. Then again, you might think it's all a good idea. You wouldn't be alone if you did. Now, though, let's turn one last time in this podcast series. Let's turn to the works of Plato and learn what certain Athenians, in the wake of the spectacular failure of the Peloponnesian War, what they thought the perfect government would look like. The Republic is actually narrated by Socrates himself, so he's not simply one of many speakers in the dialogue as we've seen elsewhere, but he is rather the lens through which we see the entire matter. He begins by telling us about his recent trip down to the Piraeus, that port and fortress on the shoreline of the city of Athens. He had gone there to offer up prayers to, quote-unquote, the goddess. Presumably this was Artemis, because the Athenians usually referred to her that way. And he went to see the religious festival and the processions and so on. Now soon Socrates meets friends, and there is an amusing passage when one of the older members of this reunion, Cephalus by name, he's asked to report on what it is like getting older. Though he himself disagrees with the remark, Cephalus recounts the words of the poet Sophocles, who, when asked about how love, or the sex drive really, was treating him now that he was an old man, responded in the following way. I feel like I have escaped from the bondage of a madman, he said. He is reported to have said this apparently referring to the cooling down of the passions as one ages. And this opening of the Republic is one of the more appealing and inviting characteristics of so many dialogues. They really begin like conversations between a handful of friends, getting together randomly and shooting the breeze and telling jokes. The dialogues are generally easy to slide into because of this. But, as with many casual conversations between friends, eventually the topic turns a little serious. Somebody brings up the concept of justice and of what is just to do in a certain situation. And quickly, Socrates, as he often does, moves away from the specific, away from the given example, and wishes to discuss and come to understand justice itself, not only what would be just to do in one or another situation. Socrates wants to establish first principles. Let's not sit around talking about whether or not it is just to do this or that. Let's first figure out what justice is. And so we begin. We parse the word justice, perhaps the most important of the Socratic essences. For Socrates, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, certain concepts existed as absolutes. In the real world, we see imperfect examples of these absolutes or essences, things such as courage, love, beauty, justice. A woman may be beautiful, a man may be courageous, a leader may be just, but each of them is simply demonstrating, humanly and to a greater or lesser extent imperfectly, each of those essences. I may be as just in my treatment of others as I possibly can be, but in the end, there is always perfect justice as a superior example to my own. Now, it's hard to describe in what way these things, these essences, courage, justice, love, and so on, it's hard to describe in what way they exist for the Socratic philosopher. After all, I exist. You can look me up, come to my house, talk to me, break bread with me. You can't do that with justice or wisdom. But just as the perfect cube or sphere have their own existence, their own essence, so too do courage, love, and justice. The way in which these things exist is sometimes called aspatial, as in without regard to space. They exist on some other plane. It's not like they're hidden away somewhere in the physical universe, but rather they are templates of reality. This latter mentioned essence, justice, is perhaps the most important for Socrates. After all, his goal is to find out how people can be happiest, how they can get along, how they can cohere in a city-state peacefully and prosperously. Ultimately, citizens must treat each other with justice. They must be just to one another. This is really what underlies all of our constitutions, our philosophies, our moral codes, and our religious mandates. In the Republic, we get to the study of the state, of government, due to Socrates' desire to determine what makes a man just. Since the state is larger than a man, being composed of many men, Socrates directs the conversation to first examine the state, to detect the examples of justice in a large body of men and women. In order to do this, since all earthly examples of government are so imperfect, it is necessary to dream up, to imagine, to create a fictional state in our minds as we talk, and to try to formulate a perfect manifestation of justice in this imaginary state. Justice at every level. Now, this sort of thing is fun, really, and you've probably engaged in this practice in some partial way, at least in your own thoughts, at some point in your life. Surely you have seen some social, cultural, legal situation in whatever region of the world in which you live, and you have found something wanting in it, and you've desired or imagined how the situation might be improved. You have momentarily, anyway, crafted some sort of society in your head in which something is legalized or prohibited, something is built up or brought down, some creed is encouraged, some idea is villainized. If you are in politics yourself, then you actually do this for a living. That's what the Republic is really about as a dialogue. It's about politics. It's about statesmanship. But beware, this goes beyond crafting legislation about immigration or about the drinking age or about welfare. Socrates and his friends here in this dialogue, which is very long and divided into 10 volumes, they take on the whole thing. They set out to build an imaginary society, a fully functioning city-state in their heads from top to bottom. And you might like some of what you hear, maybe even most. I doubt there are many people today, though, who can hear the whole thing without being somewhat disturbed. And I say this with a dog in the fight. I love Socrates. I love reading Plato and considering the ideas that they put forth. I would give anything to sit with these masters and pass around a bottle of wine and just listen. But I'll be honest, the Republic horrifies me. Socrates' vision for happiness is, to put it simply, Orwellian. It is not a society in which I would like to live. But I am a little ahead of myself here. Socrates doesn't actually get to the idea of the city-state until well into Book 2 of the dialogue. Prior to that is a useful lesson in dialectic. Dialectic is the method of speaking and conversing and arguing. It's used in Plato's dialogues and in the works of many other philosophers. It's also known as the Socratic method. This is a way of proposing questions and then exploring answers, not being afraid to pose challenges, even seeking challenges in order to purify the argument, much in the way that mathematicians prove their theorems by attacking them, by trying to find faults or errors in their own thinking. In this way, good philosophy and mathematics have much in common, and indeed, philosophy and mathematics are actually branches, so to speak, of the same tree that we would call logic. I know that many people consider philosophy today to be a sort of airy, ethereal world of words that has nothing to do with reality, and they think that it's not useful in the way that mathematics is useful for making buildings, computers, and space rockets. But the earliest philosophers were all mathematicians as well, and vice versa. Anyway, the dialectic of Plato, of Socrates, sets forth an idea and then exposes it to attacks to see if it can stand up to them. Because, and this is important, because truth really needs no defense. Things that are true are unbeatable. If the proposition that you set forward in an argument is true, it will withstand all attacks. So then, trying to explain what justice is, someone proposes the following to Socrates. Justice is giving to each man what is proper to him. Justice is giving to each man what is proper to him. Then the argument really begins. Soon there are some attacks on this idea, and it's refined a little bit until it becomes the following. Justice is the art which gives good to friends and evil to enemies. And this apparently simple idea, which I'll tell you right off the bat, it's not going to stand up to further tests in this conversation, but this idea might actually resonate with you. It rings a bell, so to speak. Yes, when we apply justice in criminal situations, in legal situations, for example, we want the bad to be punished and the good to be rewarded, right? But Socrates points out in his frustrating tendency to poke holes in every argument that might hold water, he points out that physicians do good to friends when they are ill, and pilots or ship's captains do good to their friends when their ships are in danger at sea. And when we're at war, we fight with our enemies and make alliances with our friends. And everyone present agrees with Socrates. But then, Socrates says, this means that physicians are no good to friends who are not sick, and pilots are no good to men who are not on a sea voyage, and justice is useless in time of peace because we cannot do evil to our enemies or ally with our friends in such a time. And so the conversation carries on, seeking to purify and define the idea of justice. The idea of justice. At one point, a sort of bully by the name of Thrasymachus butts in to the conversation. He insists that his own version of justice be examined and declared victor in the match of words. His definition of justice? Justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger. This is simply might makes right under another name, and there is an interlude, which you can enjoy for yourself, in which Socrates tears down this idea. But eventually in the conversation, it comes time to create the city, the just city, the exemplar of justice in the world. And what does that look like? Socrates is more Confucius than Buddha. What do I mean by this? At the risk of oversimplifying Confucianism, and I'm absolutely oversimplifying here, Confucius was an ancient Chinese philosopher. He lived in the 6th century BC, and he was more interested in politics and statesmanship, really, in the construction and sustenance of the state than in individual morality, although personal ethics were definitely a part of his philosophy, and I'm not an expert in Confucianism, so let's not go there. What I'm trying to say is that people often come to philosophy and also to religion with one of two goals: to improve themselves or to improve society. People come to Buddha or to Jesus, among others, because they are convinced that something is wrong with them. Something's wrong with them personally. They are suffering, and they want the suffering to end. They want to be happy. Sometimes, though, people come to philosophy with the same goal: to fix themselves, to acquire existential peace, to figure out how to be happy while living in an apparently broken world. People can also, however, come to religion or philosophy with the goal of fixing society. They want politics, which is really just a manifestation of philosophy in the public sphere. They want politics to fix that broken world. Sometimes people come to religion seeking this same thing. As a Catholic, I can tell you that there are people in the pews every week at Mass who are there to heal their souls, and there are people there who are there to fight the culture wars. I have been both of those people at different times in my life, and it may be in the long run, it may be that both approaches are needed in life and society, but that's a discussion for another time. Socrates, at least the Socrates of the Republic, Socrates is more interested in the state, in creating a society that creates good people, happy people. Let's look at that city, and you can judge how happy you would be to be in it. Now, right away, Socrates and friends determine how the populace should be divided up. A man is best off focusing on the one thing that he is good at his profession or his status in life. So the shoemaker is best at making shoes. The physician is best at helping the sick, the soldier best at guarding the state, the farmer best at raising food, and so on. So it is foolish for men to be spending parts of their day doing other things. The farmer should not waste his personal time and energy making his own shoes, nor should the physician spend time raising his own food. No, each man needs to focus on his own particular set of skills. So straying from your profession is prohibited, and therefore, in this state, soldiers will just be soldiers and nothing else. Now, in particular, this last bit, this should strike you as something of a contrast in your mind with tradition in Athens. Athens had always run a citizen army. As you may remember from episode 12 in this second series about the city of Athens, the Athenian army was made up of citizens from different ranks of society who supplied their own arms and armor. There were different ranks in the army for those with differing quantities of wealth, but all were citizens with their own professions, or perhaps they were freed slaves with their own separate skills at farming, shoemaking, shopkeeping, music making, leather tanning, and so on. You may also remember that bit there about the soldiers just being soldiers. This sounds an awful lot like Sparta, where the state was protected by a class of citizen who did nothing but train for war, and besides whom all were inferior. And the friends gathered for this conversation mostly agree with Socrates that society should be divided thus into classes, so just like the way Athenian society had always been divided into 3 or 4 economic strata, except in this new society, in this republic that they're imagining, the classes would be divided by their purposes. And we have already discussed now what we can call the producing class. There are citizens who work and produce goods: the farmers, the blacksmiths, the fishermen, the shopkeepers, the shoemakers, and also the professions like physicians and teachers. This is the vast majority of the society. In fact, initially in the dialogue, Socrates envisioned for his group a very simple state really made up only of these producers who all live simply and in harmony. Here is a sample of his vision for them. Let us consider, first of all, what will be their way of life now that we have thus established them. Will they not produce corn and wine and clothes and shoes and build houses for themselves? And when they are housed, they will work in summer, commonly stripped and barefoot, but in winter substantially clothed and shod. They will feed on barley meal and flour of wheat, baking and kneading them, making noble cakes and loaves. These they will serve up on a mat of reeds or on clean leaves, reclining while they recline upon beds strewn with yew or myrtle. And they and their children will feast, drinking of the wine which they have made, wearing garlands on their heads, and hymning the praises of the gods in happy converse with one another, and they will take care that their families do not exceed their means, having an eye to poverty or war. But, said Glaucon, interposing, you have not given them a relish to their meal. True, I replied, I had forgotten. Of course, they must also have a relish, salt and olives and cheese, and they will boil roots and herbs such as country people prepare. For a dessert, we shall give them figs and peas and beans, and they will roast myrtle berries and acorns at the fire, drinking in moderation. And with such a diet, they may be expected to live in peace and health to a good old age, and bequeath a similar life to their children after them. But when this vision of a simple society is challenged momentarily, hear what Glaucon has to say to this. He says, yes, Socrates, and if you were providing for a city of pigs, how else would you feed the beasts? He's apparently not very impressed with the way Socrates plans to feed them and house them and clothe them so simply. So Socrates then agrees to imagine a larger, more prosperous city-state. But, being so prosperous, this city will now need guardians. The guardians will also rule over the producing class. Since it is best for a person to do only one thing, it would not be appropriate for one of the producers, a farmer or a tanner of leather, let's say, to also be a soldier or a ruler. Those who rule and those who guard must simply do those things. A ruler must simply rule. But to prevent these guardians from becoming corrupt and tyrannical, the constitution of this city-state will forbid them to own any property. The guardian class, while armed with both weapons and the prerogative of leadership, will possess nothing. They will receive their food from the producing class, but they will not be able to accumulate any money or own anything. And it is necessary to further divide this guardian class into the two groups I've mentioned. The auxiliaries will be the soldiers who actually fight and defend the borders. The rulers will be the class assigned to govern over the entire populace. But neither class will possess wealth or property of any kind. But how to keep peace among these classes? How to ensure that this political design does not become corrupt? We all know that great political schemes, like the Constitution of the United States, can look good on paper, but still result in a corrupt ruling class that does not have the best interests of its people at heart. We can make as many laws as we like, but these can always be corrupted. It is best for a society to have citizens who are formed and raised properly, who are disinclined to corruption and crime, rather than to focus on laws to restrict bad behavior. So how shall we raise, form, and teach this population of this three-part society? This is where things get even more interesting. Socrates suggests that the myths of their present society are unfit for good education. Revered as the gods are, there are far too many stories about Zeus's philandering, about the petty jealousy, and about the brazen cruelty of the gods, and so on. So Socrates proposes to edit, to censor, really, all of these stories, to purify them, until only edifying stories are told to the citizens of this new society, who will now be brought up with myths that teach them to be honest, faithful, courageous, and so on. Therefore, in Socrates' eyes, thousands of years of myths will be thrown out, erased, to avoid corrupting the youth. The stories that are left after this mass censorship will be stories that only tell encouraging things, stories that foster what we have come to call the four cardinal virtues: courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance. These virtues are still taught today in catechism classes around the world. Furthermore, it will be necessary to tell all their citizens, rulers, guardians, and producers, to tell all of them a single lie about their past that will convince them that they are all brothers and sisters, and that they should always be in harmony and accept their status in society without question. This lie, which he calls the noble lie or the royal lie, genaion pseudos in the original Greek, the lie goes as follows. They are to be told that their youth was a dream, and the education and training which they received from us was an appearance only. In reality, during all that time, they were being formed and fed in the womb of the earth, where they themselves and their arms and their appurtenances were manufactured. When they were completed, the earth, their mother, sent them up, and so, their country being their mother and also their nurse, they are bound to advise for her good and to defend her against attacks, and her citizens they are to regard as children of the earth and their own brothers. And citizens, we shall say to them in our tale, you are brothers, yet God has framed you differently. Some of you have the power of command, and in the composition of these he has mingled gold, wherefore they also have the greatest honor. Others he has made of silver to be auxiliaries, and others again who are to be husbandmen and craftsmen he has composed of brass and iron. And the species will generally be preserved in the children. But as all are of the same original stock, a golden parent will sometimes have a silver son, or a silver parent a golden son. And God proclaims as a first principle to the rulers, and above all else, that there is nothing which they should so anxiously guard, or of which they are to be such good guardians, as of the purity of the race. They should observe what elements mingle in their offspring. For if the son of a golden or silver parent has an admixture of brass and iron, then nature orders a transposition of ranks, and the eye of the ruler must not be pitiful towards the child, because he has to descend in the scale and become a husbandman or an artisan, just as there may be sons of artisans who, having an admixture of gold or silver in them, are raised to honor and become guardians or auxiliaries. For an oracle says that when a man of brass or iron guards the state, it will be destroyed. Such is the tale. Is there any possibility of making our citizens believe in it? So, their youth was a dream, according to Socrates, as what he will tell them. They are all children of the same earth mother, but their individual souls or beings are made from metals, so to speak, and those who are gold will rule, those who are silver will guard, and those made from lesser metals will be the producers. But Socrates does not want to simply establish another aristocracy of blood. This would be nothing new, a ruling class that passes on power to its children, who, as he and his friends and all of us know today, even good rulers often have children who are not fit to rule, and sometimes people of the lower producing class have superior children who should be leaders. So, how to keep people in their proper class according to the nature and the merit of their character? Children will be evaluated in this republic and judged as they grow, and then assigned to the appropriate class. Now, obviously, coming out of a traditional family, this would be difficult. What father of gold, a ruler over this republic all his life, what father like this would be cooperative after hearing that his son's soul had been forged of brass or iron, not of gold, and he would have to become a blacksmith instead of an elite ruler? In Plato's Republic, we don't have to worry about this situation because there are no traditional families for the guardians. Remember, I said they get no property, nor do they get to have marriage. There will be a sort of communism of women among these citizens of the guardian class, and fathers will not know whose children of the women are theirs, because there will be no particular relationships. And the rulers of the state will have to use more falsehoods, more lies, openly offered here as tools of statecraft by Socrates, in order to arrange that the superior specimens of the men among them mate with the superior specimens of women as often as possible, and that the most inferior rarely do so. This will be done at public festivals, which sound a bit from the description like orgies, and the children born from these unions will be brought up in common, separate from their parents. As for the children of inferior pairings, the children of lesser men and women, Socrates has only the following to say: the offspring of the inferior will be put away in some mysterious, unknown place. The other children, the ones not so disposed of, will be raised in a group by the state, and thus it will be easy to evaluate them and assign them to a class as they grow to become a ruler, a guardian, or a producer. And women will not be slaves in this society, though it may have sounded like that. As children grow, they will all train in athletics and receive the same education, the women and the boys, all the same. All children, male and female, will have the same opportunity to demonstrate their mettle, so to speak. Women who demonstrate the appropriate skills may become guardians and rulers. The city will be an absolute meritocracy in this sense. People will do what they are suited to do and not have their talents wasted due to their sex or their station in life, nor will they be tasked with doing things that are beyond their natural scope or ability. This is part of the happiness of the state. As frighteningly controlled as it may seem, and as upsetting as the idea of the eugenics is, certainly to my ears, I must admit that the proposed state excels in ensuring that all citizens are put to work in what they are most effective at. And this is a surefire way to increase overall happiness. If people are good at their job, their role in life, they are more likely to be content with their station. Now, having such a populace, all functioning at what they are best suited for by their character and nature, and their rulers preventing from acquiring property and becoming corrupt, there will be little need for laws and courts. People will avoid crime and disputes because they will all be naturally happy and content in their lives, and they'll be inclined to honesty by their education and their formation. Naturally, those who rule over this state are philosophers by nature, men and women who seek truth and wisdom, who are intelligent, and who are otherwise uninterested in the things of the world, uninterested in riches and appearances. Indeed, in order to safely guide the ship of state, they must be able to see through appearances, to see the true nature of things, which is not easy, because the appearances of the world naturally deceive. In Book 7 of the Republic, Socrates elaborates on how the world deceives us with his famous allegory of the cave. And now I said, let me show in a figure how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Behold, human beings living in an underground den, which has a mouth open towards the light, and reaching all along the den. Here they have been from their childhood, and have their legs and necks chained, so they cannot move, and they can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning around their heads. Above and behind them a fire is blazing at a distance, and between the fire and the prisoners there is a raised way, and you will see if you look a low wall built along the way, like the screen which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets. And do you see men passing along the wall, carrying all sorts of vessels, and statues and figures of animals made of wood and stone and various materials, which appear over the wall? Some of them are talking, others silent. Like ourselves, they see only their own shadows, or the shadows of one another, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. Now Socrates elaborates on this strange image quite a bit, properly dissecting Plato's ideas of forms and essences and universal things, though, would require a long series of classes that would ultimately end up as a philosophy course, which I'm not qualified to teach. But for the student of history, it is important to have some grasp of what Socrates is trying to teach here. The philosopher, then, is the man who has freed himself from the chains pictured here in this allegory. He has been outside the cave, and after the initial shock of seeing the true reality of things, he is able to understand that he is seeing the real essences or forms of things. In other words, while we in the cave, what the rest of us mistakenly call the real world, while we see the imperfect shadows of those forms, we see men and women and imperfect examples of beauty and justice and courage, the philosopher, freed from the chains and outside the cave, he sees the essences. He sees what perfect beauty actually looks like. He sees what a man is and what a woman really is. He sees that perfect circle on which all other circles are based. He sees and understands true justice. And it is incumbent upon him, out of his duty to his fellow man and woman, to return to the cave and to try to explain the reality which is denied to the rest of us. The people in the cave will think him mad, but hopefully some of them will also throw off their chains and come to see reality, to see the essences and the forms. And those who do this, they are the philosophers, and they are the ones with the gold souls in his perfect republic, the ones who are perfect leaders of that society. Now, You wouldn't be the only one seeing it as a little convenient that a philosopher determined, after a lot of hard thought, that philosophers should be in charge of the world. It was afterwards dreamed and even contemplated right here in the dialogue that this would actually someday come to be true, that a philosopher king would arise and create and rule over a perfect society, much like this republic. The dream of this perfect society, led by a philosophical or spiritually pure elite, would manifest itself in a variety of historical attempts at societal perfection. Many see the community of the early Christians, as described in the book of the Acts of the Apostles, as one manifestation of this. Others see the earliest Muslim communities as the same. Even before these religious movements, though, centuries before, there were movements and rulers who would, either openly or not, hearken back to this idea, the ideal of the philosopher king. When we read about Alexander the Great here shortly, the boy king and conqueror who was educated by Aristotle, who was himself a student of Plato's academy, when we come to Alexander's leadership, this idea of the philosopher king should come to mind. Plato would not have to wait, though, for Alexander to come several decades later. Sometime around 360 BC, when Plato was already quite aged, he journeyed to Syracuse on the island of Sicily with one of his disciples, who was a prince in that city. The old philosopher became embroiled in the succession to the throne, and he wished for his disciple, who was named Dion, to become the philosopher king of that powerful city. This, however, did not work out, and Plato himself was sold into slavery after his disciple's brother secured the throne. Plato's freedom was purchased by a friend, though, and Plato would die free some years later, surely disappointed in the death of the dream. The Republic contains much more than all this, but as I've said before, this podcast is not Cliff's Notes for Plato or anything else. You should read the book yourself, and if it helps, check out my curriculum series number 12, as more episodes drop there with some advice for engaging more with the material that you read and retaining the information that you want from it. You can find that series on the website at western-traditions.org. The Republic continues to be read and appreciated right down to today, and here in the later volumes of the dialogue, you will find another blueprint showing and explaining all the different types of government. Here they're separated into 5 categories: aristocracy, oligarchy, democracy, tyranny, and timocracy, the latter being just really another form of rule by the wealthy, but the wealth in that case, in the case of timocracy, is specifically determined by land ownership. But we've been through all that before, for the most part, in previous episodes. The Republic remains probably the most popular of Plato's works. Down through the ages, it has acquired a following that is as complex as its narrator and its purveyors. In recent times, both Mussolini and Martin Luther King were open fans of the work. Hardly a pair that you might imagine in agreement. George Orwell, 20th century writer of anti-totalitarian classics like Animal Farm in 1984, Orwell loathed the Republic, and if you look past the imaginary contentedness of the divided populace of the book, you might see why Orwell, and I for that matter, find the whole thing disturbing. Socrates, in the dialogue anyway, we don't know what the real Socrates would have been on board with regards to all this, but the Socrates of the dialogue intends to censor and edit and erase portions of the treasure of Greek mythology, and that alone horrifies me. And then he plans to lie to the people of this state about their origins and tell them ridiculous fictions about their childhood being a dream and all that. And all this is justified, allegedly, because it will make the people happy and the state prosperous. This is just the ends justifying the means, and perhaps my Catholic upbringing impedes me from accepting and appreciating this clear violation of basic morality for me. Now, there is much more to the entire corpus of Plato's works, and I strongly encourage you to not only read the Republic, but to pick up his other works. There are links to his books on the website at western-traditions.org. But we now are finally going to leave Plato behind and move on. We're not done with Greek philosophy, however. Prepare yourself. Aristotle is coming. Until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.